Welcome back for our second lecture in this year's series of Lenten lectures, hosted by the Theology Department here at the University of St. Thomas. Our topic this year, as you're aware, is Americans on the Road to Sainthood. I wonder if we might begin with a prayer which was written by one of the Americans on his or her way to sainthood, and that's the prayer that Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen wrote for the University of St. Thomas in 1947 when the university was founded. I'd like to use this prayer introductory to each of the lectures this season. Let us pray. O God, who desirest that all men should come to the knowledge of the truth, and to this end did enlighten the world with the wonderful learning of St. Thomas Aquinas, mercifully grant that this university, dedicated to his name, may be a seat of wisdom to the young, a mother of good counsel to the community, a blessing to all its benefactors. And as thy eternal truth did become flesh and dwell amongst us, so may that same truth become action in all thy students, that they may think the things that are right, and under thy merciful guidance perform the same through Christ our Lord. Amen. This evening, the American on her way to sainthood is Dorothy Day. And we have, as speakers this evening, two of her eminent followers, Mark and Louise Zwick. Mark was born in Ohio, Louise in Pennsylvania. Mark did 4 years of philosophy and 4 years graduate work in theology in the mid-1960s. He then went on for a master's in social service administration at the University of Chicago, which he received in 1969. He moved to Youngstown, where he and Louise met. Together, they founded and directed Gilead House, a neighborhood center in the inner city of Youngstown. They also founded Storefront Clothing Store, and they organized the North Side Neighborhood Council and block groups, which comprised about 250 members. In 1970, the couple moved to California, Modesto and San Mateo, about 15 miles south of San Francisco. Mark was at the Center for Training in Community Psychiatry, the Department of Mental Hygiene in Berkeley, and he subsequently worked as a psychiatric social worker, coordinator of children's group therapy services. Louise, in the meantime, earned her Master of Library Science in 1974 at the University of California at Berkeley, and then served as librarian in San Mateo. From 1977 on, they've lived in Texas. It was also in 1977 that a momentous event occurred in their lives. Wanting to learn Spanish better than they had, they decided to take a trip to El Salvador, not expecting that civil war would erupt upon their arrival. They also learned of the base communities of the Catholics in that country and of the struggle for social justice by the population there. And this left an indelible impression upon them. From 1977 to 1980, they served as members of Volunteers for Educational and Social Services under the Catholic Bishops of Texas. Mark was Director of Social Services and Adult Education at St. Teresa's here in town. Louise worked at the Houston Public Library. In 1980, they founded Casa Juan Diego, for which they are most famous. They also founded the Houston Catholic Worker newspaper. Casa Juan Diego is a house of hospitality for immigrants and refugees. As they said to me in an email, our experience in El Salvador in 1977, when we landed in the middle of the beginning of the Civil War, was significant in our founding of Casa Juan Diego, of the Houston Catholic Worker newspaper, to receive refugees and immigrants. Mark and Louise have 2 children. They also have 2 grandchildren, one of whom very wisely has chose to become a student here at the University of St. Thomas. Without further ado, I introduce to you Mark and Louise Zwick.
We're very honored to be here at the University of St. Thomas this evening, and especially honored to speak about Dorothy Day. She is the inspiration for all of our work at Casa Juan Diego, the Houston Catholic Worker, where we have received thousands of refugees and immigrants over the past 30 years and continue to do so, especially now the sick and injured, the paralyzed, the battered, the pregnant, the homeless in a strange land.
I too am honored and very grateful to the university for allowing us to share it with you all. On this very day, March 16th, in the year 2000, the Vatican agreed to a request from the late Cardinal O'Connor of New York to begin the process of considering whether Dorothy Day should become a canonized saint. So this was the day when the Cardinal O'Connor began the process. So it's a good way to celebrate it, is to share about Dorothy and Peter. I visited with Dorothy Day with my mother back in 1960. People frequently ask, well, what was she like? And well, she was rather reserved, and she seemed tired. But she immediately involved us in the works of mercy, asking us to drive a family to New England, where they had a house to stay in, since their parents were both seriously ill. She gladly received my mother's offer of sheets from the family department store, the sheets for all the beds in the houses of hospitality. We noticed when we visited the New York Catholic Worker that there was an alcoholic priest there. Apparently, a part of Dorothy's living out the faith was caring for these men and trying to get them back on their feet. I'm glad to have met this saint. It's good to know that saints can be normal human beings, practical and matter of fact. Some people only know of Dorothy as an activist and pacifist who irritated government officials like J. Edgar Hoover, who wanted her arrested, but was probably stopped by ex-seminarians who had become FBI agents. So they didn't want to see a Catholic get in trouble with the law. But Dorothy was much more than an activist, and if we convince you of nothing else, we hope you convince you that she's much more than an activist. She was a mystic who knew the spiritual masters. She saw an active, her life was an active, contemplative one. She worked much on her union with God. Dorothy Day was born in 1897, and she died in 1980. At the occasion of her death, Catholic historian David O'Brien described her as the model of Catholicism. He said she was most significant, interesting, influential person in the history of American Catholicism. On her 80th birthday, New York's Cardinal Terence Cook presented Dorothy with a special greeting from Pope Paul VI. Even while still alive, she was getting credits. Her picture and articles appeared after her death, appeared in Time, Newsweek, and Life magazines. The New York Times said she was a nonviolent social radical of luminous personality. After her death, Father John Hugo said at a talk at Marquette University, he was a great friend of hers, Dorothy Day had been at our times also a luminous example of the twofold love of God and neighbor focused into one in the fire of divine love. In regard to the childhood of Dorothy, even as a youngster, was seeking for God. Even in her childhood, there was a spiritual awakening. Although her family members were not active churchgoers, neighbors or ministers at different times invited the children to go to the Protestant churches. Dorothy was baptized and confirmed in the Episcopal Church at age 12. Her love for the Psalms came out of that experience with the Episcopal Church. She already has a great love for the Psalms. During this time, she came to know Catholic families and described some of the youthful encounters with them, including a neighbor, Mrs. Barrett. Dorothy told how she found Mrs. Barrett on her knees, unselfconsciously praying the rosary after the housework was done. She describes that in several places in books that she has written, how that impressed her, that this woman was on her knees after the housework is done, reciting the rosary, and was very nonchalant about it. In her books, Dorothy recounted her childhood conversations with a Catholic friend, Mary Harrington, who told her about the saints. Dorothy's father, a newspaperman, did not allow junk reading in his house. That's what he called a lot of the literature. No detective stories of which he called trash reading. And so as a teenager, Dorothy was forced to read good books. And she read them all. It's hard to believe that she read so many of these, but she was a great reader even as a teenager. She read especially Dostoevsky, where she learned about human suffering. She read not only Dostoevsky, another great Russian novelist, also Charles Dickens, but besides him, Jack London and Upton Sinclair. These novels brought her to a consciousness of the suffering of the poor, of the workers who labored long hours in mindless, difficult work for low wages in places where there were no provisions for safety. Her adolescent reading also included the New Testament, John Wesley's sermons, the works of St. Augustine, William James, the variety of religious experience, and that's how she discovered, would you believe, she discovered two great Catholic mystics through one who was an atheist, William James. So Dorothy learned about Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross through him. She also was familiar with the Imitation of Christ and Husband's novels that gave rich detail about Catholicism and liturgy. She read the moving story by Robert Louis Stevenson about Father Damien and the lepers. Dorothy wrote later about her struggle with the ideals presented in her reading and the reality she saw about her. As Dorothy wrote, and I quote, "Whatever I had read as a child about the saints has thrilled me. I could see the nobility of giving one's life for the sick, the maimed, and the leper." She continues, "But there was another question in my mind. Why is so much done in remedying the evil instead of avoiding the evil in the first place. There were hospitals to take care of the sick and infirm, and of course doctors were doing much to prevent sickness. But what of occupational diseases and the diseases which come from not enough food for the mother and the children? What of the disabled workers who received no compensation but only charity for the rest of their lives? Where were the saints to try to change the social order, not just to minister to the slaves, but to do away with slavery? End of quote of Dorothy. Dorothy had always been open to the religious spirit, and her search for the absolute throughout her life was accompanied by concern for the poor and just social order. She was truly a pilgrim of the absolute. However, things went astray with Dorothy. After 2 years as a student at the University of Illinois, her faith was undermined. Her childhood faith was undermined. She wrote later about the comments of a professor who told the students not to criticize religion because some people, especially the weak, needed, the strong do not. She was taken back by this and went downhill from there. During college, she turned to socialism as she searched for answers. When her family moved to New York, she'd also with them. She became a newspaper woman against her father's wishes. He did not think a woman should work in such fields. She began to work in New York for a socialist journal. She participated in radical movements and demonstrations and was jailed several times for picketing. So the woman who, on the way to sainthood, did not live as a saint as the several years before her conversion. In New York, she lived a bohemian lifestyle, spending her nights cavorting in bars with other writers and journalists, especially Eugene O'Neill, who recited to her from memory at a bar Francis Thompson's poem, The Hound of Heaven. It was quite an experience and very impressed Dorothy tremendously. Eugene O'Neill was not good for Dorothy, obviously. During her time in Greenwich Village, as she returned home in the early hours of morning after a night of drinking, she had noticed the immigrant women going to early morning mass each day. And so what she started to do, even after still drinking and being up at late hours, she herself began stopping at the churches to pray. Dorothy had a liaison, a relationship with a man named Lionel Moise, and became pregnant. He insisted on an abortion to preserve their relationship, and as soon as she had one, he abandoned her. She was devastated by both the abortion and the abandonment. Later, she had a common law relationship with Forrester Batterham, an anarchist, and became pregnant again. Foster, too, was repulsed at the idea of having children, but also by the idea of marriage, family, and church. Dorothy, though, was filled with joy when she knew that she had conceived a child. She thought she would never be able to have another child since she destroyed the first one. She said it was her joy in having a daughter that brought her to the faith, that helped her to believe. She was so intense and joyful over this, for being pregnant. It was the idea of having a child that brought her to the point of taking instructions in Catholicism and having her daughter baptized. When Dorothy was baptized, this meant a complete break with Forster and a beginning of her life as a single mother. Her conversion was really a leap of faith, knowing that she would have to leave the man she loved and begin again alone with her child. She worried that the decision to become Catholic involved a betrayal of the working class. Her radical friends said that religion was the opium of the people. They also said Dorothy was too religious to make a good communist. The text that Dorothy used for coming into the church was the Baltimore Catechism, the same one that some of us have studied a few decades ago. Robert Ellsberg, who writes much about Dorothy, has said that Dorothy was at a loss about how to reconcile her new faith and commitment to social justice. Ours to get the two together. He said, Ellsberg said, following her baptism in 1927, that's when she was baptized, she spent 5 lonely years in the desert praying that she might find a way of life, reconciling body and soul, this world and the next. After several years as a Catholic, during which she continued to work as a journalist and began writing for American Commonweal, a great event occurred in Dorothy's life. She attended a huge hunger march early in the Great Depression in Washington, D.C. As a journalist. She felt she could not join the march now because it was sponsored by communists, but she was torn, wanting to support the workers. She prayed afterwards in the crypt of the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception that some ways would open up for her to use what talents she possessed for her fellow workers, for the poor. This was on December the 8th, 1932, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. Louise and I met 30 years later on that day.
When Dorothy returned to New York after praying in the crypt there to find a way to use her new faith and unite it with her social concerns, Peter Morin, a French peasant, was waiting for her at her apartment where her brother and sister-in-law were with her daughter. Peter Morin talked to Dorothy for several days straight without interruption about the great tradition of the church and how this could be lived out through his ideas of a program of houses of hospitality, the 7 corporal and 7 spiritual works of mercy, roundtable discussions for the clarification of thought, and farming communes. He was looking for someone who could start a newspaper, and George Schuster, then editor of Commonweal, had referred him to Dorothy Day. It was a very significant decision for Dorothy to accept Peter's program. She wrote in The Long Loneliness that she never would have understood him or accepted it if she had not been reading the lives of the saints. When Peter had convinced Dorothy about his ideas of starting a newspaper and implementing his program, she said, "Well, where will we get the money?" And he answered, "In the Catholic Church, you don't have to worry about money. It's easy. Just pray and tell people what you're doing, and they will help." And that's really the story of the Catholic worker, and we have to say of our Casa Juan Diego as well. So Dorothy and Peter began the movement during the Great Depression, when the number of unemployed in the United States was staggering. 25% of the population was out of work, and there were many men who left their families because it was just one more mouth to feed. And interestingly enough, and this is not such a well-known fact, Dorothy and Peter saw even workers who were Catholic listening to the Communist Party rhetoric because they used the language of workers' rights and concern for workers as part of their strategy of winning the workers to their cause. And while the vast majority of the rank and file of the workers were not communists, but rather, as Dorothy said, of every creed and color, many industrial workers, miners, laborers, and the unemployed were being drawn to communism because it seemed that those were the ones who were caring about the masses of the unemployed. And communism was intellectually fascinating to a lot of people in the 1930s. But Dorothy, who had already tried socialism before she became a Catholic, decided not to merely condemn communism and socialism. In fact, she kept up with some of those friends, but to create an alternative. The great irony of her life is that while she was sometimes accused of being a communist, she and Peter from the beginning presented a different vision for Catholics who might have turned to communism out of desperation in the midst of worldwide depression. They brought workers the teaching of the popes on the dignity of the rights of workers, and some have said their influence was crucial in New York in stemming the tide of communism. So the newspaper that Peter Moran asked Dorothy to found and edit was called The Catholic Worker, an answer to the Communist Daily Worker. But there's some confusion because some people thought it was the Daily Worker, and even today sometimes people call us and ask us to stop sending that Daily Worker. The Catholic Worker newspaper would be based on faith, a faith whose richness Dorothy and Peter wished to present to readers in all its fullness, including the social dimension. It would be based on a Catholic understanding of work and on the encyclicals of the recent pontiffs, beginning with the earth-shaking Rerum Novarum of Pope Leo XIII, which supported the organization of labor unions at a time when they were illegal and workers had few or no protections. Peter knew that the encyclicals were wonderful. He also knew that very few people read them, so he wanted to make the encyclicals click in this newspaper. The Catholic Worker also presented an alternative to the economic system which had left the social order in disarray. So Dorothy and Peter not only started a newspaper, which soon grew to have a very large circulation, hundreds of thousands, but gave much practical help to workers and the unemployed. Their movement gave immediate aid in houses of hospitality, a place to stay, and bread and soup lines. A cup of coffee and cottage cheese with cottage cheese, peanut butter, or apple butter on bread, as they said, whatever they had was a common menu for breakfast, as large numbers of men lined up for breakfast. And then later they added hearty soups. So one of the central ideas of the Catholic Worker Program is the living out of the 7 corporal and 7 spiritual works of mercy. The daily practice of the works of mercy recommended by Peter Moran was based on Matthew 25 and the following verses, the earliest tradition of the Church and the lives of the saints. In her writings, Dorothy wrote out the list of the works of mercy for the benefit of the readers who may not have known all of them. And she said, the spiritual works of mercy are to admonish the sinner, to instruct the ignorant. And she said instructing the ignorant doesn't mean people who are stupid, it means people who don't know. So publishing a newspaper was a work of mercy, for example. To counsel the doubtful, to comfort the sorrowful, to bear wrongs patiently, to forgive all injuries, and to pray for the living and the dead. And then she wrote, the corporal works of mercy are to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to give drink to the thirsty, to ransom the captive, to harbor the harborless, to visit the sick, and to bury the dead.
Chapter 25, verses 31 and the following in our Holy Bible is the basis, is our mission statement in the Catholic Worker Movement. On Judgment Day, we get the answer. The Lord is going to say, come ye blessed of my Father into the kingdom prepared for you from all eternity. For I was hungry, you gave me to eat, thirsty, you gave me to drink, naked, and you clothed me, sick and in prison, and you visited me. And the people say, when, Lord, did we do that to you? And the Lord will say, what you did to the least of my brethren, you did to me. So it's serving Christ and the poor that the worker movement is all about. The bad news are what comes from the left, and after we heard from the right. The left says, depart ye cursed into everlasting fire. For I was hungry, you did not give me to eat, thirsty, you did not give me to drink, naked, and you did not clothe me, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. And they will say, when, Lord, did we do that to you? And the Lord will say, what you did to the least of my brethren, you did to me. The Catholic workers, and this is a very important part of the movement, we're not, of course, we have it in a double way at Casa Juan Diego. we can't get government aid even if we tried because our people are not documented. But the movement really felt that we should serve the poor rather than the government doing it. Jesus asked his followers to do in the Sermon on the Mount and Matthew 25 to carry out this gospel. They're very much a part of the movement is the philosophy of personalism. We're rooted more in France than other countries. There's Polish personalism, and, French personalism. And founded by Emmanuel Mounier, Peter Maurin spoke French, and so that's why we very much in New York in the 30s were into personalism, because he could understand. He's from France and could explain it and help put it into practice. So when the ships were down, we ended up with the French version, which is very good. Peter emphasized the dignity of the person and the great possibility that one could do with one's life. As Emmanuel Mounier said, one does not free a person from the bonds that paralyze them. One frees a person by attaching him to his destiny. And that's the basis of our personalism. One does not free a person by detaching him from the bonds that paralyze him. One frees a person by attaching him to his destiny. By destiny, Mounier and Peter Maurin did not mean determinism, fatalism, predestination, but vocation in freedom. That is what they meant.
Peter Maurin wrote in what they called easy essays, little prose poems. He read very widely, but he brought it down into a little pithy prose poems that someone called easy essays. And so he described with deceptive simplicity the personalist vision of the Catholic worker. A personalist is a go-giver, not a go-getter. He tries to give what he has and does not try to get what the other fellow has. He tries to be good by doing good to the other fellow. He is ultra-centered, not self-centered. He has a social doctrine of the common good. If you think about that, it's kind of a mouthful. So in Catholic worker houses of hospitality, the emphasis on personal responsibility and voluntary poverty means doing the work oneself. There are, for example, no janitors in Catholic worker houses. Scholars and workers alike were and are expected to take personal responsibility. So as one author put it, this interpretation of personal responsibility is applied to daily routine, as when one worker complained to another about some overflowing garbage bags, evoking the response, if you see something that needs done, do it, take personal responsibility. And of course, living the gospel and providing hospitality to many poor people was not easy. One of Dorothy's famous quotes, which was actually Dostoevsky's quote from the Brothers Karamazov, one of her favorite books, was, "Love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams." If she were here today, Dorothy would begin by speaking of the great seasons of the church and the meaning of Lent. She would probably point out that one of the things that is missing is that we don't really understand the folly of the cross, about which she spoke so often. For many who have admired Dorothy, her activism, her radicalism, her being jailed for her advocacy of peace and refusal to participate in preparations for war have been unaware of her profound spiritual life. She made a holy hour each day before the Blessed Sacrament. She went to daily Mass, weekly confession. She prayed some of the hours of the Divine Office. She always had lists of people tucked into her prayer book that she was praying for. She participated each year in what came to be called the retreat, or the famous retreat given by Father John Hugo and other priests from Pittsburgh, and they gave them at the Catholic Worker at Dorothy's request. People often did not understand the Catholicism of Dorothy and Peter. Mel Peel, who wrote a book called Breaking Bread and also wrote an essay in a book called Revolution of the Heart, said the place to begin to understand Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker is with the worker's religious orthodoxy. He said, almost from its beginnings, the movement's adherence to traditional Catholicism has been misunderstood or dismissed as a curious anomaly. Secular radicals and many Protestants have often considered it a baffling or irrelevant hindrance to the movement's admirable social views. The historian Lawrence Vasey, for example, is one of those who have considered the movement's churchly orthodoxy a strange, marginal quirk. The Catholic worker, he declared, insisted on maintaining a tenuous tie with the Catholic Church. But the tie was not tenuous.
Dorothy and Peter felt that all the beliefs of the worker movement are very much rooted in the faith and in the Catholic tradition. Dorothy never said or wrote anything, that is after conversion, never wrote or said anything except expressing it through the faith, through what she believed. Dorothy put it, we try to shelter the homeless and give them clothes, but there is a strong faith at work. This is Dorothy saying there is a strong faith at work. We pray. If an outsider who comes to visit us doesn't pay attention to our praying and what that means, then he'll miss the whole point. If an outsider who comes to visit doesn't pay attention to our praying and what that means, then he'll miss the whole point. As we were waiting for immigration to come to arrest us for doing the works of mercy at our Catholic worker house in Houston, in Casa Juan Diego, these words were important to us. They were crucial for us in our understanding and embracing the Catholic worker movement. We discovered that not only did Dorothy and Peter speak of living the gospel, what might be considered a radical way, radical but maybe normal way, taking the words of Jesus literally, but when they spoke about any issue, they expressed it in the language of faith, of the scriptures, of tradition, and of the saints. As we mentioned earlier, Dorothy's cause for canonization was introduced in Rome 2000, and she is now formally a servant of God. Some say Dorothy should not be canonized because she said, "Don't trivialize me by trying to make me a saint." Cardinal O'Connor answered this in his letter to Rome introducing her cause. That such words may seem damning. They are in fact paradigmatic of Dorothy Day, deep faith and commitment to the Church. Her personal humility was such that she never considered herself to be holier than others. The Cardinal mentioned in his letter that she understood that many of her day would have dismissed her Catholicism and her thirst for social justice as only fit for saints, and not for the everyday believer she considered herself to be. She had a deep love for the saints of the Church. And Peter said, all of this combined to make her, as Cardinal O'Connor said, all of this combined to make her renounce any notion of personal sanctity as a means to make her something other than what she had already striving to be, a simple woman living the gospel.
The people who quote Dorothy about "don't call me a saint, don't dismiss me so easily" may be unaware of the many times she quoted Léon Blois, who said there is only one unhappiness, not to be one of the saints. If you've driven down Durham Avenue, you may have seen these words on the fence on the side of Casa Juan Diego. Cardinal O'Connor addressed the question of Dorothy's abortion when he introduced her cause. He said, "To be sure, her life is a model for all in the third millennium, but especially for women who have had or are considering abortions. It is a well-known fact that Dorothy Day procured an abortion before her conversion to the faith. She regretted it every day of her life. After her conversion from a life akin to that of the pre-converted Augustine of Hippo, she proved a stout defender of human life. And Cardinal O'Connor said he contends that her abortion should not preclude her cause, but intensifies it. It's interesting to us that Cardinal O'Connor is the one who introduced her cause in Rome. It has to be done by the place that she's from, where her work was in New York, because here was a man who was the archbishop for the military ordinariate for some time, introducing the cause of a pacifist. Dorothy's a great model of nonviolence and a commitment to the works of mercy as opposed to the works of war. She participated in many demonstrations against war and picketed to support workers at a time when unions were illegal. She was also committed to nonviolence, was a pacifist in World War I. It would be an exaggeration to say that Dorothy Day all by herself created Roman Catholic nonviolence in the United States, but it would not be too much of an exaggeration. For nearly half a century, she was the most famous, most influential, and most energetic voice proclaiming that Catholics could and should be nonviolent, precisely because they're Catholic. She inspired many Catholics to commit to nonviolence and to explore specifically Catholic ways of expressing and explaining their commitment. Of course, not everyone agreed with her opposition to war, and often subscriptions were canceled by those who were supporting particular wars. Now, we want to talk a little bit more about Peter Morin. Credit for the Catholic worker movement is given to Dorothy, and justly so. However, the most important influence in her life and in the movement was Peter Morin. Although they were founders together, Dorothy always gave him credit as the founder of the movement. Francis Sisius has said it's absolutely certain that without Dorothy Day there would have been no Catholic worker, but is also certain that without the spiritual influence of Peter Morin, there would not have been a Dorothy Day with a perspective capable of creating that movement. Peter was the oldest in a very large family, 21 children. There were 2 mothers. He was born on May 9, 1877 in Languedoc, southern France, where his family lived on the land. It was in his home and in his village, and especially with the model of his father, that Peter was formed in the Catholic faith, as well as with the De La Salle brothers, the Christian brothers. As a teenager, he went to a Christian brothers' school and later entered the order as a novice and taught several years with them. He had an excellent education and formation in the faith with them, but he left the order before he made final vows. That was actually a very tumultuous time in France. The secularism was coming in more and more, and they were closing the Catholic schools as well. Peter participated in lay movements in France after that and later immigrated to Canada, partly at least not to be subject to the military draft where he had to go back every year for several weeks, and after 2 years in Canada, immigrated to the United States. Peter was a real scholar as well as a peasant. He read the Fathers of the Church, the French Personalists, the Lives of the Saints, and he knew the Scriptures. He often quoted the prophets of Israel and the fathers of the church. He would say, the prophets of Israel and the fathers of the church say, and particularly when he was doing something like criticizing usury. He told of how the early Irish monks combined scholarship and agriculture to model a new way of life to the people of the Dark Ages. And he recommended roundtable discussions for the clarification of thought, and those have become a part of the Catholic worker movement as well. Peter was ahead of his time in his advocacy of organic gardening, diversified farming, and sustainable agriculture. He spoke of growing what you eat and eating what you grow in your own area rather than the model of massive agribusiness and shipping food all over the country and the world. But one of the most important contributions Peter made to the Catholic worker and to the world was his insistence on living out one's convictions, not just reading about them, studying them, or collecting facts and information. He was not in favor of waiting to develop 5-year plans or blueprints for one's life or setting up bureaucracies, but rather recommended simply beginning to live the gospel and to learn by doing. He made the Gospels come alive by the way he lived. Like Dorothy, Peter went to daily Mass, weekly confession, and made a holy hour each day. Dorothy said that if she needed to consult with him about something, she would know where to find him in the parish church before the Blessed Sacrament. Dorothy wrote in the September 1945 Catholic Worker that Peter Mora not only brought the ideas of St. Francis of Assisi to the Catholic Worker movement, but lived in many ways like St. Francis himself. The joy and excitement of Francis in living the gospel in poverty and freedom while working to change the social order through the methods of the gospel was also Peter's. Like Francis, Peter gave up any ideas of power, domination, or expediency as means to accomplish his goals, but rather inspired others with the idea of their vocation. Peter died in 1949 after an illness of 5 years. Dorothy continued on with the movement with the help of many people, young and old, who were committed to the vision of the Catholic Worker. But Dorothy and Peter knew that the answers to social problems did not lie simply in secular theories or in war. They believed that the powerful force of living out the gospel is the only way to counteract the dominance of evil, and insisted that personalist action be closely united with prayer and contemplation. It was neither pie in the sky when you die, nor putting all of one's hopes in human progress, but rather working in the world in cooperation with grace, the power of God. As Dorothy said, "I see around me sin, suffering, and unutterable destitution. There is misery, materialism, degradation, ugliness on every side. All I see some days is sin. The problem is gigantic. Throughout the world there is homelessness, famine, fear, and war, and the threat of war. We live in a time of gigantic evil. It is hopeless to think of combating it by any means other than those of sanctity. To think of overcoming such evil by material means, by alleviations, by changes in the social order only, all that is utterly hopeless." Their hope for a better world was with God and the efforts of Christians. We want to share with you tonight that we have received word of a miracle that has just occurred, apparently as a result of prayers asking the intercession of Dorothy Day. In December 2009, Richard Fossey, who used to teach at the University of Houston here and is now up at North Texas, he invoked the assistance of Dorothy Day, asking her to cure his friend Sarah Maple of a brain tumor that doctors told Sarah would kill her in 2 years. He wrote a letter to us a little over a year ago, and we published that letter in the Houston Catholic Worker. He recently wrote to tell us that Sarah Maple has had a miraculous healing of the brain tumor. He said he prayed every day for a year. He might have missed a few days, but he tried very hard to pray every day. She had received good MRIs through the autumn of 2010, but in December she went for her regular visit to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, and the doctors told her that her brain tumor had disappeared. One member of Sarah's medical team, who is Catholic, told Sarah that she had never seen anything like this, and she believes Sarah's remarkable recovery is a miracle. So Richard has sent this information to the Guild for Dorothy Day and spoke with Lourdes Ferrer, who heads up the Guild, and she said it is the first miracle that has been reported to the Guild for Dorothy Day. Naomi's asking about, that's our granddaughter, asking about Dorothy's family. Her daughter had, is it 9 children?
Yes.
Yes, 9 children, married young and had 9 children. And at least 2 of them are very supportive of the canonization process. One of the grandchildren, who now has gray hair, Martha Hennessy, incidentally, there's different Hennessy's involved with the Catholic Worker Movement, and that's very different from Ammon Hennessy. Martha Hennessy is very involved in the Catholic Worker Movement and very supportive of the canonization process. The question is, what about Dorothy's legacy, and what is the state of the Catholic worker at this time in history in the United States?
Well, I think the movement mirrors the church. Where are your friends? People are at different levels and different an amount of commitment. So the same in the Catholic Worker Movement. People are at different places in terms of church doctrine in terms of Catholic action.
What became of the houses Dorothy Day founded? They're still operating in New York City. There's a very large house named Mary House, and then down the street, St. Joseph's House. And there's a Peter Morin Farm, where Tom Cornell, who now has gray hair, looks quite different, who was in that video, he and his wife and their son are at this Catholic worker farm called Peter Morin Farm, which sends vegetables down to the city that they grow.
The building still exists where Dorothy died, where Dorothy purchased originally, and then she died there in 1980. That building is still a Catholic worker house.
Actually, Dorothy traveled around the country a lot, meeting with communities that were interested in starting a Catholic worker house, so she was really instrumental in starting many of the houses that exist today. Naomi? What about voluntary poverty?
Well, voluntary poverty means we don't pay anybody, nor is anyone paid. It's the secret of Casa Juan Diego, the secret of its survival is that no one is paid as voluntary poverty.
Peter Morin had this idea also from St. Francis of giving your work as a gift. Even before starting the movement, he was giving French lessons in the United States, and he decided not to charge anymore for the lessons. He told people they could give whatever they wanted to offer because he didn't want to charge for his work, but to give his work as a gift. So people live and work in the houses and depend on the generosity of so many people that help in the work.
Working without pay, I think, maybe is what you're getting at. Working without pay changes how you perceive what you do. It makes a big difference not being paid for your efforts. And you, as I mentioned, you look at things in a different way. It's more than just saving money. It's really opens one to the creative juices. They flow much freer where there's voluntary poverty, when there's not.